Hey everybody, it's me, everyone's friend, Mutant Buster Green, and lately Code Geass has been trending again, and I guess it's been trending because they released a new anime in the series called Rose of the Recapture, which is the long-awaited continuation of the classic anime Code Geass. Rose has been pretty well received and has effectively revived the franchise for a brand new generation. Now, as a result, I wanted to get into this, and so I decided to get back into Code Geass. And funny enough, as it turns out, they made some movies to help you do that. So yeah, I watched the legendary Code Geass Resurrection films that all dropped in Japan around 2019 and were a pretty big deal at the time. But unfortunately in 2019, the pandemic also happened, so in the US they were kind of self-dropped on Crunchyroll, buried inside of the 20-year-old Code Geass series page, and none of them were actually dubbed except for the final film Lelouch of the Resurrection, the reunion movie with all new content. So if you don't know anything I'm talking about right now, Code Geass was an anime series that originally aired between 2006 and 2008. It aired in Japan and it aired in the Cartoon Network on the US. It follows Lelouch Lamperouge, an ousted prince of the Kingdom of Britannia with a murderous vendetta, and every night he dresses up in a big black mask and tries to take over the world with his magical Geass power that allows him to brainwash anyone he meets and totally change their behavior. But he can only do it one time per person, and it takes him like a couple of weeks to figure that out. He lives in Area 11, a fucked up alternate history situation where the British Empire continued to grow without opposition and eventually colonized the entire world. Now, I think I should mention, as an American, my perception of England is split in three drastically different ways. First of all, there's modern, realistic, normal England, the one we currently have, a messed up political dystopia with supposedly better than average healthcare, at least better than the US, where everyone wants to be some sort of a magical wizard boy, but they're too poor to do it. Then once upon a time they were cool. The perfect fantasy of England is England in the 1960s, where everyone had drugs, unprotected sex, and unlike America, who did it as savage hippies rolling around in the mud, 60s England did it with dignity, high-end fashion, and a non-stop classic rock and roll soundtrack. And finally, the worst England is the ancient nightmare version of England, America's primal and original enemy, the one who taxed people just for tea that they didn't even want to drink. They thought that dentists were scam artists, they annexed America, they conquered India, they burned down your house in the middle of the night, and they mostly consisted of stuffy old white men on boats, fighting pirates, enforcing global law and order, and generally being the world's police from the 1600s to the 1900s. Yes, that is the ancient nightmare version of the British Empire that sets the stage for the Britannian Empire in Code Geass. Code Geass, you see, posits a world where that British Empire, that Britannia, continued colonizing countries and eventually took over the entire frickin' world. An alternate universe where even in modern day, the British Empire is a threat to any nation's sovereignty, who could one day just come in and try to delete a native nation's people and heritage, oppressing all non-white minorities they come across. And the crux of the story is that in this story, they've finally come down on Japan. They've conquered Japan, they've renamed it Area 11, and now they're oppressing the Japanese. Now, I could probably go on for hours how good the world building is in the show and the wealth of untapped material on the history and on the region. Like, there's a completely unexplored plot that in the alternate history of the Britannian Empire, they were ousted from England and they actually run the world from their capital city of Pendragon, which is built on the ruins of San Diego, California. And so the British Empire just has this seat of power in America, and therefore that prevented the American Revolution from taking place. And what the hell led to that? And then, over the course of the show, Zero establishes his own United States of Japan inside Japan to oppose Britannia, and in that way, both countries are weird analogs for the United States. But anyway, I'm black holing with like side logic. Back to real life. So yeah, Code Geass aired in 2006. It came out around the same time as Death Note did. Retroactively, both series get compared to each other a lot because they aired at the same time and they were both male power fantasies where a Japanese high schooler got magical means to murder his enemies. But while Death Note seemingly withstood the test of time and stayed relevant over the years by becoming an open-ended horror franchise, Code Geass sort of just told one amazing-ass story and then fizzled out before it suddenly came roaring back to life all of a sudden lately. Like, I mean, it's hard for me to straight up compare the two of them because they both have really great stories and plot twists. The story was handled by veteran anime creators from Sunrise who had previously worked on Gundam, who then teamed up with the famous shoujo character creators Clamp, previously famous for Card Captor Sakura and some of the finest anime for women in the 1990s. Put those two teams together and you have seemingly an unstoppable team of the best in anime. And yeah, this dream cast of powerful creators made Code Geass. Code Geass comes out in 2006. 2 years later, season 2 comes out in 2008 called R2. There was also a short and cute Nunnally OVA that no one remembers that came out in 2012, which apparently has really shitty animation. I haven't seen it yet, but I might look it up. And then 2015, there was a short but ultimately forgettable side series called Akito the Exiled about a character named Akito who lived in Europe and what Europe was actually like during the course of the series. But yeah, I saw this and I don't remember it, and I don't think it was particularly good. Anyway, what I want to talk about today are the Resurrection movies. The Resurrection movies were released in Japan over a course of 2 years, about 2017 to the end of 2018, and were designed to introduce the series to new audiences. However, in America, the films were released all at once in 2019 with really no advertising. And because of that, it's not really that infrequent that I meet a lot of people who don't even know these movies exist. And the Resurrection movies consist of the 3 Code Geass recap films and then a 4th film called Lelouch the Resurrection that is a new additional sort of epilogue story. A feather on the cap of the story, and it follows a lot of those tropes that you get in these 10-year later reunion movies. Now, before going into these movies, I was recommended by a friend that I not bother watching the 3 recap films and that I just go straight into Lelouch the Resurrection. But because I hadn't seen Code Geass since it originally aired in 2019, and I had some really fond memories of it back in the day, because I had some bad experiences in college, and I feel like Code Geass was one of the last happy moments I had before those bad experiences, I decided that I wanted a refresher and I needed it, and damn it, you guys, skipping these movies is terrible advice. Anyone who skipped the recap movies is fully missing out on some of the best Code Geass action that's ever been made. These movies are freaking amazing. They literally have everything that was ever good about the series, but just compacted and ratcheted up to 11. I'm so shocked that they didn't bother to dub or release these properly in the US, because all of them are fucking bangers. I can only base the fact that they were skipped over due to the fact that they came out in the middle of the COVID pandemic. But yeah, I watched these movies and I kind of loved all of them. So let me go through all 4 of the movies now, just so you know what's what. The first Code Geass movie, Code Geass 1, is a recap of the first 18 episodes of the anime, and this movie is fucking fire. It basically straps you into a car and puts you down into a mad speed run of the original Code Geass. Now, I should probably sideline here that the whole reason I'm even talking about these movies and the whole reason that these movies even exist is that they're loosely based on the structure of the Gundam recap movies. In the 70s, there were 3 Gundam recap movies, and the first 2 were just re-ads of the show, but they did so well that they made a 3rd movie, Gundam 3, with significant new animation and plot edits to make the story flow better. Sunrise kind of used that as a model, and they did the same thing with Ideon, they did the same thing with Gundam Seed, and now they're doing it with Code Geass. Now, in this case, these 3 Code Geass movies all consist of recycled animation from 20 years ago, except Code Geass 3, which does have a teensy little bit of new animation added to it to minorly adjust the plot. But instead, all the money that was raised from these 3 movies was then used to pay for the creation of the 4th movie, Lelouch the Resurrection. Now, I bring up the Gundam films again because the first Code Geass film is weirdly structured very similar to that first Gundam film, in a way that I didn't connect them one for one when I watched the show, but watching the 2 movies together, they're weirdly alike. When I was watching the TV anime, I did see some weird thematic parallels with Lelouch's path of conquest and assassination that kind of mirrors Char Asimov's path in the original Gundam, but Code Geass 1 is a masterpiece, and it has these weird moments that sync up, Prince Clovis plays the same role in the story as Garma, and the way that the King of Britannia gives a funeral speech very similar to the one that Giran gives at Garma's funeral. But yeah, Code Geass 1 is kind of a masterpiece for what it is and what it does, just condensing the first 18 episodes of Code Geass into this absolute roller coaster ride of the best of Code Geass. I don't have too many notes on it, but for me this film is a 9 out of 10. Then we go on to Code Geass 2, and this ended up kind of being my favorite one. Code Geass 2 is a fucking miracle. It's even better than the first movie. It crams in the climax of the original Code Geass Season 1, and it somehow squeezes that climax next to a massive chunk of the show's second season, Season R2, and in that way, it's just an outstandingly interesting and creative show edit. Now, it shows some of the events that happened between season 1 and 2 in a much better and clearly understood light, because famously, when season 1 ended, it ended on a bit of a cliffhanger, and then when R2 started, it started with a weird thematic reset. Code Geass 2, the movie, does some surprisingly massive lifting and flexing with the story, presenting the events of R2 from Suzaku's perspective, not doing that weird like shenanigans where they reset the timeline and like brainwashed a bunch of people. It cuts out all the fluff of the story, and I gotta say that Code Geass 2 is a 10 out of 10 on the basis that it really does provide such a fascinating and new perspective and new insight on exactly what clearly happened with the timeline from between season 1 and season 2. As otherwise, that time period was originally treated in the original show with just all this weirdness and awkwardness because they wanted to reset the show for the sake of it being a second season. In Code Geass 2, you get basically the entire first season climax, and then it carries through most of R2 up into the point where Lelouch is reestablished and creates the United States of Japan. Now that brings us to the third film, Code Geass 3. This is probably the weakest of the 3 recap films, but it is still pretty awesome. It crunches up what's left of R2's plot into the first half, and then it goes into a batshit nuts retelling of R2's ending, turning that into a full cinematic experience and filling the majority of its runtime just with the ending episode. The third film is probably a 7 out of 10 for me, because while it does contain a lot of the show's late stage hyperlogic, I want to say that hyperlogic was made more understandable in the movie, but there's still some crazy hyperlogic that like the King of Britannia had almost absolute god powers because his older brother was like an immortal child or something, and then he was using the souls of dead people to connect a power gateway to Jupiter, so somehow he could use the power of Jupiter or something. I didn't really get it then, I don't get it now. They still is some kind of magical gobbledygook. But anyway, you can at least tell that they were trying to adjust the story to make it more understandable, and in some ways they succeeded. Now, overall, these movies are amazing, and I feel like if you are a fan of the show, you really should experience them at least once. I will say, though, that there were a lot of characters who got some major story edits and who got themselves kind of benched by having a lot of their story elements removed. Like, in the first film, they cut out the character of Mao. Mao was Lelouch's predecessor with C2, who had a malfunctioning Geass, and that was a setup for the Princess Yuffie death scene later, because Lelouch's Geass starts to malfunction like Mao's does. And I even rewatched the show after this and noticed that anytime they mentioned Mao was cut out of the movie version. But since the movies are throwing out so many events so fast, you just kind of gotta live with it and accept, oh, suddenly his Geass doesn't work in the movie version. But yeah, here's some other like overviews of characters who got shafted in the recap films. Ogi got completely shafted. Ogi was originally kind of like an analog for like a Jew in the Holocaust, but now he's just like a generic dude and he's just kind of there. So he still has that affair with the British lady in Amnesia, and her story gets entirely shafted because she was kind of like a threat and kind of scary at first, but then they like, I don't know, somehow like she got amnesia and then she was no longer a threat, except somehow she got over the amnesia, and that whole thing was kind of a mess, so they just skip over it. The other biggest character who gets kind of screwed over is probably Rollo. Rollo is Lelouch's brother in season 2, except he's not really Lelouch's brother. He's actually a Britannian spy and kind of an overseer overseeing Lelouch to make sure he doesn't go evil again, except he completely fails. And because I don't remember what happened to Rollo in the original show, and because the film omitted it, I honestly gotta say that Rollo's storyline gets completely butchered, and he has almost the worst treatment in the film because so much of his behavior is just completely unexplained, other than the fact that he like fell in love with Lelouch and became obsessive. There's also Sayako, Lelouch's maid, who suddenly becomes an OP ninja. I don't think that was ever explained, but yeah, that's just another crazy thing that you have to accept. Probably the character that I would say gets the worst treatment in the films is Nina Einstein. Nina was in the show a shy, nerdy lesbian who changed into a batshit insane war criminal as she was exposed to the various crazy war crimes that happened in the show and reacted to them very poorly. She eventually develops nuclear weapons in the show, and she has a massive vendetta against Lelouch, and was honestly one of the most interesting characters in the anime for how unhinged and random she was. In the film, she's just sort of there. She still invents nuclear weapons, but they don't make a big deal deal of it. And I swear to God, they really added her storyline in the third film to make her just more passively okay with Lelouch. Like, she went from an unpredictable agent of chaos to just a cute girl with glasses who stood in the background and do nothing. I feel so annoyed that they took away Nina's like threatening menacingness. I'm also going to point out that the films weirdly specifically were seemingly created around avoiding the death of Lelouch's pseudo-girlfriend Shirley Finette, who died a senseless and cruel death in R2 when Rollo shot her out of paranoia. Like, literally surgically adjusting the story minorly at points through all three films, just so they could avoid the death of Shirley in season 2, where she spins out and dies randomly like she did before. Now, I'm kind of really divided on this point because overall it just seemed to me like frivolous fan service, and despite doing all this, Shirley isn't even in Lelouch of the Resurrection, the fourth movie, so I don't really know why they jumped through all these hoops to revive her. Like, all she like really appears as in that movie is like a painting in the end credits. So the whole like bringing Shirley back to life kind of seemed like a massive waste. Like, did anyone really love Shirley that much? Shirley seemed like a character who was like originally posited as Lelouch's most likely potential girlfriend before getting completely benched by several more aggressive female suitors, and her cruel and merciless death was pretty much the only thing she really had going for her, showing the tragedy of what would happen to a normal everyday person who lived in this fucked up world of global treachery. But it was kind of a really fucked up death for a character who otherwise did nothing wrong and maybe just deserved to live a peaceful life. On the flip side, though, cutting out her death makes her an absolutely useless character in the story, especially as the compilation movies reduce almost all of her screen time to her just being a normal girl who Lelouch has nothing to do with and actively ignores. I honestly think a tighter edit of the show could have given almost all of her traits to Colin Kozicki, especially as Colin was living a double life anyway in the first season. And I mean, if Shirley had turned out to be Colin, I mean, that would have been a mind-blowing twist. Although I assume Lelouch still will have clocked her immediately either way. So, I don't know. Leave a comment if you think Shirley deserved to die or live happy. I've got nothing else to say about Shirley. Anyway, so this finally brings us to the fourth movie, Lelouch of the Resurrection, the movie that finally consists of brand new content and consists as an epilogue set 2 years after the events of the series. And wow, so this movie was definitely a movie, a very complicated movie. Now, I was so hyped up for this movie after watching the 3 recap movies that I was so curious about what they would do after all these years. What more did they have to say about the Code Geass world? And as it turns out, I'm very let down to say that they had nothing new to say. If anything, this was just an aggressive member-berry movie like, hey, remember Code Geass? Remember Suzaku? Remember Lelouch? Remember that they flew around in mecha and pretended they were like playing chess while killing people? Like, I don't know, this movie was kind of rough to watch. Like, it definitely did capture the tone of what an episode of Code Geass was, but they had to jump through some amazing logic loops to arrive there. So, Lelouch of the Resurrection. It's 2 years after Code Geass. The world has normalized. The Britannian Empire has been fully dismantled, and we have countries again. And it's all thanks to Lelouch, who sacrificed himself to become the dictator of the world. And anyway, basically, there's 2 plots playing out here, but they eventually sync up. The first is that Nunnally and Suzaku are captured by this rogue nation, and this rogue nation is an amalgamation of Iran and Pakistan with a made-up name. They show it on the map, and on the map it seems to just literally be Iran and Pakistan put together as one country, so I'm just going to leave it as that. Now, this kidnapping is the initial problem that the movie revolves around, and then the Black Knights are really just Colin, the maid, the pudding guy, and Nina, and What's-Her-Face go off to try and save them. And so, yeah, they go off to this weird Arabian country. The country is run secretly by a lady who has Geass powers. She also has a crazy cyborg brother and another minor guy who has a vision-scrambling Geass. Now, at the same time, C2 is also in this country for some apparent reason. I guess her reason is that she's there investigating the Geass. And at first it seems completely random, but the film does pay this off. Oh, and also C2 has with her the lobotomized body of Lelouch, who acts like a weird baby coma victim. Now, this is the big interesting twist of the movie, that Lelouch somehow survived the end of R2, but they explain it through some random bullshit that after the end of the series, Lelouch obtained immortality from his father, but because Lelouch destroyed C's world, he came back to life without a brain, and they have to fix his brain. So anyway, it takes them a while, but they manage to get into C's world and fix his brain with a portal through the Arabian castle. And after that, Lelouch finally becomes Zero again, puts on his old costume, and then tries to stage a classic, good old-fashioned Code Geass battle to save Nunnally and Suzaku. Now, it works at first, but then the climax of the film turns out that the princess of the bad country has herself a special Geass that allows her to rewind time by exactly 6 hours. So even though Lelouch easily defeats her the first time they fight, he then has to redo the scenario 4 or 5 more times, each time it getting harder because now she knows exactly what he's doing. But eventually he figures this out and uses trial and error to defeat her. Now, I'll be honest, at first I thought this was a cool idea, but they rewound time so many times that by the third act of the film, I was completely bored and zoning out and checking my phone. Because you kind of just see the same thing over and over again, and it feels like they're just reusing footage to save on animation. Anyway, through a series of trial and error science experiments, Lelouch eventually guesses what her Geass does and then bluffs that he knows what it does. He does seemingly misestimate and underestimates her that she can rewind 9 hours instead of 6, but maybe he's just trying to cover his bases and be thorough. And anyway, he eventually defeats her by putting her into a 9-hour nap. So she's finally defeated, status quo is restored, everyone can go the fuck home. Now, the movie minorly touches that Cornelia is still out there leading some sort of a private nation, and she still hates Lelouch, but she makes an exception to help him in this situation because she also cares for Nunnally and did not want Nunnally being in danger. So no one else really has a satisfying story in this film. Everyone else is just sort of there. You find out that Ogie had a baby, so he's not really like actively doing anything. The only characters that do get a nice wrap up in this movie is Lelouch and C2. It does finally canonize the relationship between them and implies that at the end of the movie, because Lelouch had like no other things to do in his life, the two of them finally hook up and essentially become married to each other. This also includes a cryptic post-ending scene where they seem to have become a married witch couple who does weird occultic shit in the woods somewhere. Now, to be honest, I'm kind of mixed on this because outside this movie, just watching the Code Geass story and the recap movies, I most properly ship Lelouch with Colin. I thought she and him had the most romantic and sexual tension with each other. C2 seemed indifferent to Lelouch at most points in the series up until the ending. And on the other hand, I would say in the compilation movies, she did express a few feelings for him near the end of the series. And the Lelouch of the Resurrection movie does try to push them together by expanding on their relationship. And it does a lot of the work to make that ending work and to make it pay off. So I will say the movie at least tried to justify how it got to this ending by basically explaining that Lelouch in this movie is only alive because C2 brought him back to life, and then C2 like raised him like a coma victim, took care of him like a baby, and therefore this Lelouch deserved to be with this version of C2 because they generally did take care of each other. Anyone else who wanted to be with Lelouch, though, is kind of fucked over because he doesn't give them a second thought or even check in on them. So I am going to say that. So yeah, this movie wraps up the harem relationship situation with Lelouch and C2 finally getting together. Now, one of the things I didn't enjoy about the movie was I thought that one of the boldest and most wild things about the original Code Geass is that the enemies they were fighting were the Britannian Empire, which was essentially coded to be an overpowered world domination version of England. And like I was getting into that with like my original enemy thing at the start of the video, that the British Empire itself has preconceptions for the audience for what that stood for and what that might mean to your life. And it's one of the main things that made the original Code Geass just so goddamn compelling, because the British Empire was a real scary thing that actually existed at one point in history. Now, in the movie, these new villains, the Iranian-Pakistani alliance, the generic terrorist kingdom guys, like they just don't make for compelling villains because, anyway, the villains here are just too bland and uninteresting. They're just generic Arabian villains. And honestly, if anything, the villain for this movie really should have been Cornelia, because they established that she had a desire to maintain the Britannian Empire. She had an unsettled vendetta with Lelouch. She was still mad about what happened to Yuffie. Anyway, I'm not going to rate the Lelouch of the Resurrection movie. It's just too majorly out of whack with the series and the compilation movies. And watching it right after the compilation movies made the compilation movies look so good that it just doesn't hold a candle to them. It's just not as wild as the original show. It's not as fast-paced as the compilation movies. And while I would say it has a great introduction to get back into the world and a decent ending wrapping up some of the loose ends, overall the film has pretty shallow writing the villains totally suck, and that middle part where they roll over the same events 4 different ways kind of felt really played out. Even though I like the story they told with it, I feel like there probably could have been a less redundant way of doing it. Like maybe if they had just like encountered her Geass a few different times throughout the story instead of just this one time it matters because it's fucking up the climax of the film, and so Lelouch tries to trial and error it. That's about it. Anyway, I guess I'm going to start to get into Rose of the recapture soon, and I'm honestly surprised that they were able to find another route to continue the story after all this. So yeah, if Rose ends up becoming amazing, I'll probably put another video up, and if I don't, leave a comment here if you want to hear back from me on that one. All right, thanks guys. I was Mutant Buster Green, and I gotta get back to playing Gundam Breaker. Oh, by the way, that reminds me, I started a Twitch channel. If anyone has Twitch, please follow me because I need 50 followers to get monetized, and right now I'm only 45 away, so help me out. I want money. Okay, thanks. Good night.